Dr. Spurling, could you tell me why otitis media is such a problem for Indigenous Australians?
Otitis media is a huge problem because of the effects it has on hearing, and it occurs at such a young age and in such high prevalence. And that effect on hearing impacts on all sorts of social interactions. And then if you feel that you're socially isolated or you can't hear stuff in school in particular, then you get behind in your education, which is a key socioeconomic determinant. And if you get behind at school, you tend to drop out and you miss then all the opportunities that education gives you, and it's even been linked to ending up in the prison system. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are overrepresented in the prison system. So if you think about it like that, it has a huge impact. It's very common. It causes a huge number of problems for a large number of people, and the problems end up being very severe and really perpetuating the socioeconomic disadvantage. And I guess the other part of that question is that it's disproportionately high amongst Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people because of socioeconomic disadvantage. There's really no evidence that there are genetic elements to this, it's a common misconception, I think, to conceptualise Aboriginal health as genetic difference. So you have things like the thrifty gene and stuff like that thrown up, which just have no basis really. Pressure.
So, for a young doctor moving to an Indigenous community, are there differences that he should expect on presentation of otitis media?
Yeah, well, I think you're going to see a lot more otitis media in really young kids, in babies, and you probably have to look for it in them because they're not necessarily going to complain about it. I think the average, your first attack, you're getting a lot of attacks even by 3 or 4 months, whereas in non-Indigenous kids the average is much later. Most kids will have had an attack of otitis media by the time they're 2 or 3, but you're getting the presentation is much earlier. You would definitely want to know about the PBS subsidised drops for running ears. You're going to see a lot more discharging ears, and you're also going to see a lot more kids with hearing problems. That probably, you're probably going to need to be much more conscious of who your hearing health worker is and your referral pathways to get your ears tested. You're going to need to know who the speech therapist is. You're going to need at Cherbourg, I think they have a program for kids in schools where they have hearing aids and the teacher wears a microphone and things like that. So you probably are going to have to make the effort to find out who the teacher at the school is and get to know the community, which is all stuff that you wouldn't necessarily have to do, even though it'd be nice in a mainstream urban general practice in Brisbane. So getting to know the community much better in your referral pathways. There would be a couple of elements of the presentation, like the severity and the age, I guess. And then in terms of the management, you'd have difficulty with access to services, but it would be about the drops is the main difference in management. I guess the other, and also whether or not antibiotics are indicated, we don't know the answer to that question yet. Though I suspect it would be hard not to prescribe them. And the other thing is that, given overcrowding is such a big factor, is to address socioeconomic determinants in the consultation and bring them up. And that can be very culturally sensitive. There might be particularly good reasons why there are lots of kids or 2 families, for example, in the one house. And also, some families would be worried about, as a new doctor, why you would be asking questions about that. What are you asking questions if you didn't know the community really well? So the community need to be able to trust you when you're asking that question, that you're not then going to call docs, for example. So, I've worked here for 10 years, so I can ask that stuff and people aren't going to be worried about that. But if you're a new doctor in town, you'd have to be a bit careful about that. But if you could present it in a way that showed that you're wanting to help them and try and resolve the housing issue for them, then that's probably going to be the best way of stopping that kid coming back with further problems with otitis media. So you might need to know who the person is who coordinates housing, who's the social worker, for example. What's the situation with daycare? Has the kid been immunised, I guess, all those sorts of things.
Are there differences in the time to diagnosis in remote communities for otitis media?
Oh, I'm sure there would be. The only remote communities I've worked in was in Thursday Island, And you know, you're talking about people having to come in from other islands, and that would be the same in remote communities where there's limited access. So yeah, you're going to get much later presentations. Here in Inala, where the access is reasonably close physically at least, you know, we get the whole spectrum of pretty mild otitis media that's almost certainly viral right through to the discharging ears, which can come up quite quickly. So you know, you can get quite a virulent otitis media that you know comes up and causes the discharging ear within a matter of within a matter of days, and the parents may not be aware that it's about to happen, and all of a sudden they've got a kid with a runny ear. And really, there's there's not an awful lot doctors can do to stop that damage from happening. Antibiotics haven't been shown to prevent perforation in the systematic reviews. And at the moment, where the question of antibiotics for otitis media for Aboriginal kids is one that's largely unanswered. And so this service is part of a grant, or part of an NHMRC funded trial looking at antibiotics for otitis media in Aboriginal kids and Torres Strait Islander kids. So it'd be interesting to see the answer.
Is there pressure to subscribe?
To prescribe?
Antibiotics?
Not so much. I think our group you kind of train your practice to as to how you practice as far as that goes. I think all the doctors at the Inala Indigenous Health Service would see antibiotics as a non-renewable precious resource, and so you know it's not being handed out sort of willy-nilly for viral type things just in case it turns into something else. So I think a lot of our patients have been pretty much educated that you know we'll prescribe it if we think it's indicated, rather than you know just sort of carte blanche, and so it's pretty well accepted. You know, we don't really get, I can't remember the last time I would have had a consult where someone left clearly crossed that they weren't getting antibiotics when they thought they should have. So yeah, I think, and also I think the best predictor of a satisfied patient at the end of a consult is not whether they got the antibiotic or not as it happens, it's whether they understood your reasoning. So yeah, we don't get a lot of...
So there's been what are your thoughts on the mobile screening program and the remote diagnostics? What are your thoughts on the mobile screening program and the remote diagnostics for otitis media?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it's excellent that there is a program that is helping detect the kids with hearing problems and ear problems, because if they go undetected and you can't you know, improve their hearing, then you run into all those problems I was talking about before with loss of educational opportunity, which means that you have reduced employment prospects and all the problems that go with that, including higher incarceration rates. There's not a lot doctors can do about that, in my opinion, but it's worth picking up because you can then address it at the school level with you know, speech therapists and hearing aids and teachers on mics and things like that. And you know, certainly if kids have chronic perforations, that can be fixed by ENT surgeons. So there are some roles for doctors in all of that, and I think it's important to have a screening program. It's not, I guess, addressing the downstream causes for why people are developing, why there is such a high rate of otitis media. So it's great that it exists, I think it should exist, but it's not addressing the underlying causes. It's like
measure for the interim.
Well, it's like catching, it's like, you know, you've got this waterfall of cases and you're down the bottom, you know, trying to sort out the people who've fallen off the waterfall and patch them up and get them as best prepared for society as possible without stopping the waterfall.
Finally then, I'm a BMP student, so I'll be spending quite a lot of time out in Indigenous communities, I imagine. Do you have any general advice?
Okay, yes. So when you introduce yourself to people, find out where they're from rather than what they do. So non-Indigenous people like us, I don't know where you're from. And yeah, I know you're a med student, you know I'm a doctor, you don't know where I'm from. But Aboriginal people wouldn't even talk to each other like that. So it's a good way of building rapport is to find out where their family's from. And if you see two Aboriginal people meeting for the first time, they'll talk about their family. Getting to know, going and making an effort to, if you're in a community, for example, find out who the elders are and go and actually meet them. Spending a little bit of time in community events rather than sort of showing yourself away in your own community would be helpful. And then probably some of the most important stuff is not talking down to people, being very careful about docs. You're likely, being able to acknowledge that you're likely to make a mistake. So you really need a cultural mentor, so you need to go and find out who that would be. Someone who knows the community really well and is willing to sort of coach you, I guess, through it. So you need to leave your ego behind a bit and accept that you're going to make mistakes. And you can't be neutral. People have this idea that they should be neutral and treat everyone the same, but in fact that's a recipe for disaster, in fact. Because you are going to have preconceived ideas and all sorts of notions when you meet Aboriginal people, and if you don't deal with them and in fact put in place the verbal changes and language changes to communicate properly with Aboriginal people, then you're going to be missing the boat. You can't treat everyone the same. Being really careful about keeping people waiting. So historically, Aboriginal people have felt, I think, probably quite truly that they've been kept waiting because they're black. Being really careful about that, and if you do keep people waiting through no fault of your own and apologising for it, I think is really important. Some doctors have this funny idea that they shouldn't apologise for keeping people waiting, but even if it's not your fault, it's no skin off your nose really, and it makes the consult go so much better. And the other thing to be really careful about is children. If you really think a child is being well looked after, then say it. And say it often, and then you get a reputation through the community as someone who's on people's side. If you've got concerns, then go and find out what the backstory is from your cultural mentor before knee-jerkly reporting or whatever. Obviously, if it's a clear-cut case of abuse, then you've got no choice. But you have to be really careful about that, and go. You need to find your cultural mentor.